Why did the 53rd Battalion struggle at the Battle of Isurava? We look at the errors in raising the battalion.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 101 of the Principles of War podcast, Mistakes in Mobilisation for the Mice of Moresby. We've spent about 4 episodes looking at the performance of the 53rd Battalion, predominantly during the Battle of Isurava. It comes down to, realistically, 3 weeks. Their performance, through no fault of their own, was not great. It wasn't of the level that you would expect of Australian soldiers in combat. Now what we want to do is we want to start looking at why they weren't able to perform to that level. Peter Brune, in his book, Those Ragged Bloody Heroes, writes, "In the long, proud history of Australia at arms, there can be no more tragic and damning story than that of the raising, deployment, equipping and training of the 53rd Battalion." Some of the events that transpired between the formation of the battalion and its fight at Isurava may shock you. However, there were many battalions that were treated potentially not as badly, but quite badly, as Australia mobilised for defence of the nation. Mobilisation is a difficult process, and it was part of the Japanese strategy to strike quickly with strategic surprise so that the Allies would not be able to effectively mobilise not only their combat power, but also their industrial might before they were able to achieve their strategic end state, being the securing of enough strategic resources to be able to once and for all fix the China problem. For nations going through the mobilisation process, time can be a critical limiting factor. If we think back to the centre of gravity analysis that we did for the Battle of France, when we were looking at the French army, the Maginot Line was designed specifically to buy 6 weeks to enable the French army to mobilise its conscripts. The Manstein Plan was specifically designed to deny them the time that they needed to be able to mobilise. These mobilisation mistakes, however, aren't particular to the Australian Army. They are quite common. We see some of these mistakes as the United States mobilises the 32nd Division for the Battle of the Beaches at Buna and Gona. We also see them at the start of the Korean War. And it's important to remember that it is only 5 short years from the end of the Second World War, where the United States has an incredibly capable army, through to the 25th of June 1950, the combination of lack of perceived threat, apathy, and budget cuts creates a situation where the US military is left in a parlous state, and that mobilisation is very difficult for them. Many of the mistakes we see with the 53rd Battalion are the same mistakes that are made with the Russian mobilisation for its invasion of Ukraine. So as we think about the mistakes that were made with the mobilisation of the 53rd Battalion, it's important to remember that these mistakes, they're easy to make. They're easy to make when you're mobilising, particularly when you're mobilising civilians, not militia, and even easier to make when you're doing it under time pressure. We're not sure when the 53rd Battalion was raised, or should I say re-raised. It was first raised in February 1916 as a part of the expansion of the 1st AIF. This was part of a process of a doubling of the AIF. Half of the recruits had been to Gallipoli. They were veterans. They'd seen combat. The other half came from fresh reinforcements from Australia. This is interesting. This is one way of bringing a battalion up to full strength when it has been newly created. Those veterans were from the 1st Battalion. They were going to be bringing their experience and esprit de corps to the new battalion. This meant that all of the new soldiers would have people to look up to who knew what they were going to be doing in an infantry battalion. They knew what it was like to be in combat. This would make bringing the new reinforcements up to an acceptable standard a lot easier and faster. The battalion deployed to France on the 27th of June 1916, and it took part in its first battle, which was the Battle of Fromelles. That battle, like many of the battles of the First World War, was a complete disaster. They incurred 625 casualties, including the death of their commanding officer. Those 625 casualties made up 3/4 of the troops assigned to the attack that day. They spent a freezing winter in 1916-17 in the Somme Valley. And it was during this period that the battalion got their nickname, the Whale Oil Guards. And that was after their CO, a British CO, Lieutenant Colonel Oswald Croshaw, ordered the troops to polish their helmets with whale oil, which was actually given to them to rub into their feet so that they wouldn't get trench foot, so that they would look smart when they were on parade. They took part in the advance as the Germans retreated to the Hindenburg in March 1917. They missed the first and second battles of Bullecourt. However, they did defend some of the gains that had been made after the second battle of Bullecourt. After the AIF moved to Ypres in Belgium, they took part in the Battle of Polygon Wood. During the German Operation Michael offensive in March 1918, they held the line to the north of Villers-Bretonneux. In September, they were involved in the fighting around Anvil Wood, which was critical for the capture of Peronne. It was during this fighting that Private William Curry was awarded the Victoria Cross. Their last battle was fought in cooperation with the Americans as they forced a breakthrough in the formidable German defences along the St. Quentin Canal. They merged with the 55th Battalion on the 10th of March in 1919, and on the 11th of April, the battalion was disbanded. In April 1921, the AIF was disbanded, but the militia was reformed to perpetuate the designations and battle honours of the AIF. The 53rd Battalion had predominantly had soldiers from Sydney, so that's where it was re-raised. And in 1927, it was given the designation 53rd Battalion, West Sydney Regiment. It adopted the motto, Be Prepared, and in 1933, this was changed to Esque ad finem, which is Latin for all the way to the end. In 1936, because of the impact of the Great Depression, the lack of pay, and a lack of interest in all matters defence, it was decided to amalgamate the 53rd Battalion. Initially, this was done with the 3rd Battalion, but in 1937, they were amalgamated back with the 55th Battalion. Why have we gone through the history of the 53rd Battalion in the First World War? When you're building a new battalion, it's important to build esprit de corps. It's important for the soldiers to feel like they belong to that battalion. The battle honours, the stories from the time that the 53rd Battalion was in the first AIF, they're all important in building that esprit de corps. And in fact, given the fact that the soldiers were raised from the same location, Sydney, there may have even been the opportunity to get some of those original 53rd Battalion members to come in and tell about their experience, to start that training process so that the soldiers understand what it is to be a soldier and how they need to act. A really great example of the importance of that heritage and lineage is given by Keith Irwin. He was a sergeant in the 53rd Battalion.
And one thing I'd like to mention too, which I think is very, very important to myself, the colour patches of the 1st Battalion were black over green oblong on the arm. And of course, whilst I was at the Ingleburn camp, I volunteered to go to the 53rd Battalion. The colour patches of the 53rd Battalion were the same colours but turned up end on end. But the important thing is my father was a Gallipoli veteran and he was in the 1st Battalion during World War I. And of course, when I joined the 1st Battalion, he gave me his old colour patches and I actually wore his colour patches in the 1st Battalion. And when I went to the 53rd, I just had to turn them up on end and I wore them again. And I was very proud of the fact that I did wear my dad's colour patches for all that time. With the 53rd Battalion, it was a battalion that was formed for service in Darwin.
Keith Irwin's nickname was Scoop. You can hear the pride in Scoop's voice, and he is just talking about wearing that colour patch. Very little was made of that lineage, and that is because there wasn't the time to be able to go through it. Lieutenant Colonel Ward doesn't know it yet, but on the 28th of October, he has only got 48 days until the Japanese attack on the 7th of December, and he is only 67 days away from boarding ships for deployment. There was not a lot of time for the formation of the battalion, particularly when you think of just how many troops there were within the battalion on the 20th of October. So there is 1 lieutenant colonel, 1 major, 1 captain, 1 lieutenant, for a total of 4 officers. There are 3 warrant officers class 2, 1 company quartermaster sergeant, 2 sergeants, and 1 private, for a total of 7 senior NCOs and other ranks. Now, at this point, we don't know who that 1 private was, but I think we should spare a thought for him. Not only did he have 4 officers, but there were 3 warrant officers class 2. The 25th of October sees an influx of captains and lieutenants. 7 captains, 14 lieutenants. So there's a total of 25 officers. For the privates, that's gone from 1 to 4, a total of 12 ORs and senior NCOs. The War Diary doesn't have any other returns for the ORs and senior NCOs until the 13th of December, and by that time, the battalion is starting to look pretty good. There are 8 warrant officers class 2, 6 company quartermaster sergeants, 2 staff sergeants, 36 sergeants, 59 corporals, and 914 privates. That's a total of 1,025 senior NCOs and ORs. For the officers, there is 1 lieutenant colonel, 1 major, 11 captains, 21 lieutenants, and 1 quartermaster. There's an interesting note, however, on the return of the 13th of December. The RSM position is awaiting promotion from Warrant Officer Class 2. So for all of this time, there has been no RSM. And the RSM is an absolutely critical role within the battalion. He's the senior soldier, he's responsible for the discipline, but most importantly, he is the advisor and sounding board for the lieutenant colonel. This is a position that I think would have been sorely missed within the 53rd Battalion. Not only that, there are 4 corporals who are going to be made up to sergeants within the rifle companies, and 7 empty corporal positions are going to be filled from the ranks. There is only 1 major in the battalion. Now, generally, a rifle company would have a major in command of it. That's not the case. That 1 major and all of the captains, there's 11 captains at this time, are temporary ranks. So they have been promoted without meeting the requirements for that promotion. We are now starting to see some of the big issues within the 53rd Battalion. Where did all of these soldiers come from? That is the next really interesting question. Rather than starting with the nucleus of a formed body, 18 of the militia battalions had been directed to supply 62 men each for the new battalion. Now, if you're a battalion commander, are you going to be sending your most trained soldiers? Are you going to be sending your excellent senior NCOs and junior NCOs? Probably not. In fact, many of the battalions saw it as an opportunity to get rid of some of the dead wood, to get rid of some of the troublemakers. One of the battalions went through its discipline records and found the soldiers with the largest number of charges, and guess what? They were the ones who were transferred to the 53rd Battalion. It's important to remember that at this stage of the war, the 2nd AIF is made up of 5 divisions: 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and the 1st Armoured Division. Many of the soldiers with extensive militia experience had already enlisted in the 2nd AIF. Many of the soldiers who wanted to fight overseas had already enlisted. But not all. Some of the militia COs withheld some of their key people. They wouldn't allow them to join the 2nd AIF so that they would have a nucleus from which to expand. Here's an excerpt from Bill Elliott, who was a sergeant in the 53rd Battalion, and he talks about his experience in trying to join the 2nd AIF.
I started to form the 8th Divvy to go for Malaya. And a few mates of mine and myself went up to see the CO about putting an application to transfer. And we mates were transferred over. But being an NCO, the colonel, it was just Colonel Owens, he said no, he said he wouldn't let the nucleus of his training staff go, so he knocked me back. Luck happened in my respect because, what happened to the 8th Div in Malaya. None of my mates come back from there. So I carried on there for a while. I'm not sure how long after that, but they had to send a certain number of personnel to form the 53rd Battalion, and I was one that was sent. to Ingleburn. That would be about 1941. I can't tell you the exact date. I think it was late in 41.
And how was the 53rd set up? Was it set up as a fairly effective operation, or was it a bit of a shambles?
All the 53rd was set up in this respect. You had people coming in from everywhere, dribs and drabs like, and they were trying to form the nucleus of the battalion. And as they come in, you'd put them in different sections, platoons and so forth, to build them up to strength. Of course, the training was the normal training, up bright and early, round the little paddocks for a gallop before you had a cup of coffee, then breakfast. Then you go out and do route marches, or square bashing. All the time we're getting new chaps in that you understand, like, you know.
Let's have a listen to another soldier's experience of the camp before deployment. This is Harvey Blundell. He was a signalman in the 53rd Battalion. He was conscripted in September 1940. He received a letter in the mail and he had to present for a 17-day camp in Greta. This is an excerpt of his interview with Daniel Connell.
How'd you feel about that?
Oh, well, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the camp.
And what sort of training did you get?
Well, it was mostly route marches, and like we might march from Greta to Lochinvar, which was a fair hike, and then we would have no water till we got till the other end. It was a very hot day, and it was mostly marching and some SIG training.
You feel it was very relevant, very useful?
Well, I think it was just one way of getting us used to the army after having injections and all that type of thing, which we had to overcome.
How did you feel about discipline?
I didn't mind discipline. I'd been used to discipline in working where I'd worked.
The people you were with in the unit that you were with, how did you get on with them?
Very good, yeah. They were a nice lot of fellows. These are a couple of the cards of photos that were taken of the SIGs.
Right. You were a signaller fairly early on.
Fairly early on, yeah. I stayed a signaller all the way through.
How did you get chosen to be a signaller?
Well, it was one of those things where so many would be asked, could they ride a horse or could they do this, that and the other? And then if you volunteered, well, you went into something different. So it was just one of those things where you were just picked at random and given a job as a signaller.
And what did that involve? What was a signaller in 1941 or 1940 in the 53rd Battalion?
Well, a signaller was at that stage of training. Well, we were training with flags and helio lamps, and there was very little Morse about at that time. It wasn't until we went to New Guinea that we really got used to Morse code.
And did you feel something a bit special being a signaller, or was it fairly ordinary?
Well, we did a school up at Koitaki to graduate as a Group 2 signaller, which meant another 2 shillings a day in pay, which was 8 shillings a day.
That's in Papua New Guinea?
Papua New Guinea.
Right, but before we get to Papua New Guinea, I'm just trying to get a consolidated view of how you were and how well trained you were before you left Australia.
Oh, no, we weren't well trained at all. We were poorly trained. In fact, myself, I got a lot of blisters on my heels, and I spent something like 6 weeks in the hut wearing sand shoes. So as far as training was concerned, it was very little training.
I've heard quite a lot of stories about what happened to the 55th before they went to Papua New Guinea. You know, they were told one thing and something else happened to them. What was the story of the case of the 53rd? Where were you and what happened before you went to Papua New Guinea?
We were camped at Ingleburn. We were going out on different route marches, like till I got bad heels. There was very, very little training. It was mostly route marching, and there was no real battle parades and that type of thing, you know. And we were very poorly equipped. We still had the Lewis gun to take to New Guinea. We had 303 rifles, and we had, well, all those things all came from the remains of the First War.
How did you feel as a group? Did you feel in high spirits, or did you feel depressed by what was happening around about you? I mean, we're talking about the end of 1941, when the Japanese came into the war. How did people feel when the Japanese came into the war?
Well, the Japanese came into the war on the 7th of December. Well, we were That's the stage we were more or less designed to go to Darwin.
So a couple of interesting things come out of that. Firstly, Signalman Blundell is learning flags and heliographs. Not sure how useful that is going to be in the jungles of New Guinea. However, it's okay because the 53rd Battalion is a part of Darwin Force. They are going to be protecting Darwin. He marches into the 53rd Battalion at the start of December. So he has less than 1 month before he deploys. During December, the battalion is continuing on with individual training and collective training at the company level. December 7 or 8th, depending on where you are on the international dateline, sees the Japanese strike at Pearl Harbor, Guam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Malaya. It isn't long before this has a tangible impact on the battalion. On the 10th of December, the War Diary reports 0130 hours. Warning was issued by 28th Brigade verbally for 53rd Battalion to be prepared to move at 0300 hours. All troops ready to move at 0300 hours. Transport and stores ready at 0330. 0600, orders were issued to carry on with normal training and to stand by for orders. Company training. There's a little bit of war skittishness in the air. The 28th Infantry Brigade headquarters had been notified at midnight that the postmistress in Ulladulla had heard sounds like gunfire, and that had been confirmed by the lighthouse keeper at Point Perpendicular. This is why they were given the prepare to move order. It turned out to be a false alarm. Company training continues through till Christmas Day. On the 25th of December, there's a church parade, there's a Christmas dinner, and leave is granted until 2200 hours. So, leave has been granted for a newly formed battalion at the start of a war with Japan. The soldiers in the companies have got officers who may not be overly experienced in being an officer. What could possibly go wrong? Well, at 2200 hours, they call the roll and there are 275 soldiers absent without leave. That's a quarter of the battalion. The next day, Boxing Day, Reveille, 0530, preparations made to move. On the 27th of December, the War Diary states, battalion headquarters staff worked throughout the night on embarkation rolls. Alpha Bravo Charlie Don and Echo companies departed Ingleburn camp at 0300. Entrained at 0435 under Captain Hawkins, OC train. Battalion headquarters and first reinforcement departed Ingleburn camp at 0600, entrained at 0735 under Captain King, OC train. First party numbering 869, including 104 from GDD, embarked on HMT Papa Alpha under the CO. Second party numbering 221 embarked on HMT Papa Bravo. Those two ships mentioned, Papa Alpha, Papa Bravo, they are respectively Her Majesty's Transports Aquatania and Sarpedon. The convoy has got 4,250 troops and 10,000 tonnes of supplies. But before we get to that, we need to look at the 104 soldiers from the GDD. That is the General Duties Depot. That is where newly conscripted soldiers would go to get their initial administration done, things like getting their uniforms issued to them. Sergeant Keith Irwin, he is quoted in Those Ragged Bloody Heroes as saying, "Even at this stage, we received a draft of soldiers, mostly 18 years of age. These poor devils had no idea what was happening to them. They had not been told where they were going, what unit they were destined for, or any information at all. They had received no final leave. They were given no chance to let their families know what was happening to them. They had just been taken down to the Aquatania and put on board. Most of them had never seen or handled a rifle. This was a disgrace because many of these youngsters, who had literally been shanghaied, later paid the supreme sacrifice during the battles in the mountains and at Sanananda. Once the Aquatania put to sea, we were told that we were heading for Port Moresby, not Darwin. A training program was implemented so that we NCOs could give the new recruits some elementary training in the use and handling of the 303 rifle." Here is an extract of an interview from the University of New South Wales Australians at War Film Archive with Padre Roy Watton. He was the Padre of the 53rd, and he is describing what he did on the trip from Sydney to Port Moresby.
Nobody knew what was what. It was a real schmozzle. And if the ship had been torpedoed, we'd have been all lost, you see. We didn't know where we were going. And we had 2 warships escorting us. And I got in with the education and the sports officers. We organised boxing matches and debates and all this sort of stuff as best we could to keep them amused. But we did drill, of course, life-saving drill and all that sort of stuff. But we didn't know where we were going, and we didn't know the officers and so on. And this was a terrible thing the Army did with the AIF crowd. They had a time to settle down in Sydney to know the officers, and know the men, and know one another. But here was a unit. They decided they'd send a unit to Darwin. And already the militia units had lost all their good blokes to the AIF, and then they were told they had to supply a certain number of men to go to Darwin, so they chucked out all their problems. And the 53rd Battalion consisted of all problem boys, you see. And it was very hard to get them interested in anything. And when the rumour got round that they were going to New Guinea, we had 100 desertions. And the provost went round and picked up young blokes who were AWL, sent them out to barracks and processed them. And before they knew where they were on the ship. And they'd come to me as the chaplain and say, well, you write to Mum. I could break the censorship laws and tell their mums where their kids were. Just imagine a mother who didn't know who a boy was. He disappeared. This was almost Shanghai. This is what the Army did. You're not going to make soldiers out of fellas like that, you see. So that was another job I did. I broke the censorship rules and wrote to the mothers and said, your son has been picked up. And I get another officer to sign it. He wouldn't even read the letter, you see. And that was one of my early jobs when I realised that just as well I wasn't under discipline, you see. And so just imagine these kids a lot of them were only 19.
In 2022, barely trained conscripts were told that they were going on an exercise. These Russian troops were in fact invading Ukraine. Who would have thought that that mobilisation strategy would have rhymed so closely with that of the Australian government's mobilisation plan that led to the 53rd Battalion, led to some of those troops who had never seen a rifle before being on a boat that was heading to New Guinea. Not only was the battalion in general poorly trained, but some of those troops, those 104 that had been picked up from the General Duties Depot, had been in the Army for a very short period of time. With all of this confusion within the battalion, layer that on top of what they would have been thinking about. If they had picked up a copy of the Sydney Morning Herald on the day before they got on the Aquatania, so on Christmas Day 1941, the headline was, "New Attack on the Philippines." It went on to state, the Japanese have made a big new landing in central Luzon in the Philippines, 75 miles southeast of Manila. It is not known whether the Japanese have penetrated far inland, but at the point at which they landed, the island is barely 10 miles across and they are reported to be exerting great pressure. The Japanese on Tuesday carried out a mass raid on Rangoon, the capital of Burma. Their aircraft were intercepted by British and US fighters, and 9 bombers and 1 fighter were brought down. Some of the raiders reached their objectives and caused damage and casualties. There's news from Malaya that states that Japanese transports and warships have been reported off the coast of Sarawak. Canadian troops are still holding out in Hong Kong. Soviet troops have retaken 3 important towns on the Moscow front, and the Russian successes before Leningrad are beginning to rival those around the capital. In the Crimea, however, the Germans are making fierce attempts to capture Sebastopol. Overlay all of this with the fact that once the convoy clears Sydney heads, they are told that the troops of Darwin Force are not headed for Darwin, they are headed for New Guinea. They find themselves on convoy Zulu Kilo 5, which is taking anti-submarine precautions extremely seriously. There are just 3 transports in the convoy: the Aquatania, the Sarpedon and the Herstein. Those 3 transports are protected by 5 warships. The 2 County-class heavy cruisers, HMAS Canberra and Australia, the 2 Leander-class light cruisers, HMAS Perth and HMNZS Achilles, and the sloop HMAS Swan. The jewel in the crown of this convoy is the Aquatania, and it's interesting to reflect on the strategic maritime capabilities that the Aquatania and ships like her deliver. The Aquatania was the sister ship to the Mauretania and the Lusitania. The Lusitania, of course, being famous for the ship that was sunk on the 7th of May 1915 by the German U-boat U-20. It was travelling with 1,266 passengers and a crew of 696, and of those, 1,199 lost their lives in the sinking. The sinking of the Lusitania would go on to be one of the reasons why the United States would enter the war on the side of the Allies in 1917. This trio of Cunard ships was named after Roman provinces. The Aquatania was the last of those ships to be launched, and her design was driven by the desire to compete against the White Star Line's Olympic class of ships, which was the Olympic, Titanic and Britannic. The White Star ships were about 15,000 tonnes larger than the Mauretania and Lusitania. In an interesting example of the way that British maritime strategy was developed, the Admiralty had required that the ship be designed with the capability of being converted into an armed merchant cruiser. Her design therefore was reinforced to allow for the mounting of naval guns. And the ship, when launched, displaced 49,430 tonnes. She was launched in 1913. When the war started, she was converted into that armed merchant cruiser. However, she was shortly after that converted into a troop carrier. After the conversion, she commenced voyages to the Dardanelles. Between May and August of 1915, she transported around 30,000 soldiers to the battlefield. She was converted to a hospital ship, but in 1918 she was converted back to a troop ship, and she made runs from Halifax, Nova Scotia, through to the United Kingdom, bringing United States troops into the war. On one of those trips, she transported over 8,000 men. She made 9 voyages in total and transported 60,000 soldiers. In the interwar period, she was a cruise liner. For the Second World War, she converted back to being a troop transport with a capacity of 7,400. She operated with a group of ships that were known as the Monsters. They were the Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, Mauretania II, the Ile-de-France, and the New Amsterdam. Her speed of 24 knots meant that she was capable of operating without escorts. The risk from U-boats was deemed to be so low because of the difficulty in developing a torpedo solution against a target that was travelling so fast. That risk, however, wasn't zero. On January 30, 1945, the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, a German transport ship, was torpedoed by the Soviet submarine S-13. It had been transporting civilians and military personnel from East Prussia to the German-occupied Baltic states. It is estimated that 9,400 people died, and that makes it the largest loss of life in a single ship sinking. Let's put all of this into context for the 53rd Battalion on the Aquatania on the 28th of December. The battalion was formed less than 90 days ago. It reached its full manning less than 30 days ago. There was a devastating attack from Japan just 3 weeks ago. They had been raised and trained to go to Darwin. They now find out that they are deploying to New Guinea. Many got no leave before seeing their families before deploying. 10% of the troops have been in the army for less than 14 days and have virtually no training whatsoever. They now find themselves on a ship that is at risk of submarine attack. At the heart of it, we now have a leadership problem. How will the officers and senior NCOs respond to this problem? More importantly, how well have they been prepared for this challenge? The answer is not well. But those mistakes are just the next in a series of mistakes as we look at mobilisation for the mice of Moresby.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.